about to show my method on how I ferment my turnips. One of my favorite ferments to make, and it goes well with all the Lebanese food that I love to make too. This is a very easy thing to do. The hardest part is chopping up all the ingredients. There's multiple ways you can do it. If you really want, you can use one of them slicers, mandolin slicers, but that kind of just takes all the fun away from it, in my opinion. You can slice these however you want. I like to do them in sticks like this, because if you're making a wrap or a salad or something like that, it goes well with them. But you can slice them in discs however you want. You don't want to let your turnips get too ripe in the ground. You want to cut off the any bad spots where maybe a bug burrowed in there or something like that. But it's pretty straightforward. Rinse them off after you harvest them. And chop them up. While these are fermenting, they get very tender after a while, and so whereas you might be worried about cutting them too thick, you know, they get very tender. But like I said, you can chop them up whatever thickness, however you like. Some people will just leave them like that. Some people will ferment them like this, you know, and it's really no big deal. I tend to like to get them pretty thin though, and it also seems like when you do the matchsticks, they kind of fit in the jar better. You can fit more of them in the jar. Since I have my bowl pretty full here, I'm gonna add some salt. And what's gonna happen is it's gonna significantly go down in the bowl. A good point of reference is that maybe just about every 8 cups of turnips, you'll want maybe 3 tablespoons of salt, but I don't ever measure it. I always just sprinkle it on there and taste it as I go. It's very important to taste your food when you're preparing it. So I'm just going to sprinkle some salt over the top. Usually what I do with a full bowl like this is I'll make a good layer of salt over the top, and then I'm just gonna kind of mash it in there. And then I'm going to taste it. You don't want it to be too salty. Some people like more salt than others. The amount of salt isn't crazy important, but you just want to make sure you have maybe about 3 tablespoons per half gallon. I'm going to add a little bit more. And I already see a lot of the juices are releasing out of these turnips. And the salt, through osmotic pressure, pulls the juices out. It also makes them a little more tender almost immediately. Taste it again. And a good rule of thumb also is that they won't be quite as salty after the fermentation process, because the salt will kind of soak into the turnips and it just seems like they get a little less, the flavor gets a little less salty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little more salt. But like I said, the most important thing is just to keep tasting it as you go. And you'll notice as you add salt, you'll notice a lot of the juice is starting to flow out of these. Next, what I'm going to do is add beets. And really, these are just for color. Traditionally, that's what they do. Makes them pretty, and it also adds a little bit of flavor. This is a really good recipe to use, like when you're thinning out your beet patch and you have smaller beets. You're thinning out room for the larger beets. It's a really good recipe to use for that, because you don't you're chopping them up anyway. You don't necessarily need a whole lot of beets for this recipe, and so it's a really good way to utilize those tiny beets. You can do it in multiple ways, you know. Like I said, you can chop the beets a little differently, so you can differentiate them once they're in there, because everything will be the same color after it all ferments. If you ever have an animal eat your beet too, it's another good way to utilize those beets that have been munched on by an animal. There's nothing wrong with just chopping that off and using the rest of it. Some people might have a problem with it, but those people probably don't grow their own food. Maybe they do. But this is a great way to use those. Can't give that away in a CSA share, can't sell that at a market. You know, you wouldn't want to necessarily gift it to a friend. So it's a good way to use it. Put it in your ferment. Doesn't hurt a thing. There's really no exact amount of beets I use. I probably use a different amount every time. But really, you only need like a few, like maybe 2 or 3 per jar, 2 or 3 small ones. Alright, that's plenty of beets. So back to mixing it up. And this time when I'm mixing it, I can really feel that the juices have really started to flow in this. There's more than enough beets in here. The more you add, the darker the color is going to be in the ferment. And also, I should mention that you don't necessarily have to add beets either. The recipe is totally fine without them. And even though I've been tasting it, I'm going to taste it again, because you should, like I said, when you're preparing food, always taste your food. Always taste your food. We're going to add garlic. I am adding a Roe Campbell type called Georgian Fire, because it's the spiciest one I grow, and I like spicy garlic. Spicy garlic isn't really good raw, in my opinion, the spiciest varieties. So it's really good to use in ferments and stuff and for cooking. So what I do is I'll add 3, 4, 5 cloves to each jar that I'm going to be using. And I just crush it up like that. Put it in there and add a little bit more. And then next, peppers. These are Buena Mulata peppers, a cayenne type. And you can just you can cut the tip off and just add the pepper in to only add a little more spice. You can add a more mild pepper. You can add whatever pepper you want. You don't have to add a hot pepper. Whatever you want. I'm gonna put one in on the bottom, maybe one in the middle, one in on the top. Before you fill your jar, mix it up again. Just gonna add a little pepper in the middle. Remember, this is fermenting in the jar, so even just a little bit of hot pepper will really go a long way. So if you're not too into spice and you don't want this spicy, only add a small amount of hot peppers, because it's going to go a long way for you. Do this part, you can use garlic smasher, you know, whatever, end of a spoon, but you want to smash it in there and get it really tight in there. A little bit more of hot pepper. nice and tight. And I fill it up to the base of the lid. Have some juice in the bottom of the jar or the bowl. No big deal, just add about half of what's in there. I'm gonna add a little bit more half because I used more than half of what's in the bowl. So I guess that, you know, it's comparative to how much you have in there, but just eyeball it. You know, nothing crazy. And as you can see, I did not use all the juice in the jar, in the bowl, and this jar is completely full of juice. There's no reason to add water to these ferments at all. In fact, you should not when you're fermenting turnips. I see no reason to. Up all my turnips and cut up about the perfect amount. Dump the rest of the juice in there. And here's a good example. I'm glad this happened to show you that the juice is not quite all the way to the top of the jar, but by tonight it will be. By later tonight it definitely will be. I'm going to add another chili to the top. And actually it's already almost there, just as I've been talking. See? So don't worry if you don't have it. Don't add water right away. Wait at least 24 hours, and if your turnips aren't submerged in about 24 hours, try to squish them after a day. You know, try and squish them down a bit. like I'm doing here, and the juice, it helps pull the juice out of them. But then you could top it off with just a little bit of water. But that way you never add too much water. What I'm going to do is I'm going to grab a grape leaf here. And I'm just going to kind of rip it in half. Throw it in on the top. Kind of helps keep things submerged. And if any yeast forms on top, it kind of helps block it out. Grab another one. So it's as simple as that. That's how I do it. To top the jar, I like to use these silicone airlocks. They're cheap, you can buy them in bulk, and they work very well. I think they work even better than the three-piece airlocks. And it's as simple as just putting it on like that. And that's it. Now we got our ferment going. I set it on the shelf, usually for at least a week, and then I start eating it. These will be stored for longer. This recipe is shelf stable, although it will develop more flavor and get more and more sour as the months go on. I've eaten it after 6 months on the shelf and it's totally fine. It's just, you know, it's a lot of your flavor preference. So make sure you're tasting it, and once it gets to maybe a flavor that you really like, then you can put it in the fridge if you have room and store it that way in the refrigerator, and it'll more slowly build flavor. This will last 2 years or more in the refrigerator.